Well, for a bit of legal analysis then on these latest developments, Brody joins me now on set. He is a human rights lawyer and an international prosecutor. Thank you so much for
You're quite welcome.
Joining us today. Now, you are, of course, an expert in international criminal law. There's so much to say about that field now, but I want to start with the fact that the ICC had been attempting to issue arrest warrants for Israeli and Palestinian leaders since the start of the wars. All of the Palestinians who were the targets of those warrants are dead now. That's Yahya Sinwar, political leader, Ismail Haniyeh, and military chief Mohammed al-Masri. They've all been killed. So this begs the question of what international law has to say about targeted assassinations. How do you reconcile both arrest warrants on the one hand and the fact that countries can unilaterally assassinate belligerents?
Well, I think those are, of course, two separate questions. As you mentioned, in May of this year, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Karim Khan, requested arrest warrants for 3 Hamas officials, as well as for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. This in itself really was a historic moment. It was the first time that the International Criminal Court, and indeed the first time that an international prosecutor anywhere since Nuremberg had requested arrest warrants against a Western ally. Up until now, the instruments of international criminal justice have been directed against vanquished adversaries, as in Nuremberg and Tokyo, against powerless African warlords, or against enemies of the West, like Vladimir Putin and Slobodan Milosevic. So this is the first time that a prosecutor has sought warrants against a strong Western ally, like Israeli leaders. Now, that was in May. And we are now in October. Those warrants have not yet been approved by the 3-judge chamber that has to advise them, that has to approve the warrants. And since there have been a lot of pressure on the court, we know that from revelations by The Guardian and the Israeli magazine 972, that for the last 10 years, the Israeli government, led by the head of the Mossad, have waged a campaign of intimidation, of hacking, of blackmail against 3 successive ICC prosecutors. Mafia style, things like, you better, like somebody handing them the prosecutor an envelope saying, you better do what we say, phones being tapped, an attempt even involving the president of the RDC, of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Kabila, to ensnare the prosecutor. That was all background. Since the warrant, and in fact, one of the reasons that we believe the prosecutor made public his request for a warrant was to get these people off his back. But that was May. Since then, we have seen a number of countries attempt legally, by legal means, to say that the prosecutor, that the court did not have jurisdiction, that the court had to give Israel time to investigate these cases because the ICC is a court of last resort. But it's been a record amount of time, and there's a feeling that if these warrants are not issued, it could be the death knell, really, for the International Criminal Court, which was properly so active when Russia invaded Ukraine and began to commit massive crimes, and the warrants were issued against Vladimir Putin, and now nothing seems to be done. To go back to your question about assassinations, one question is what the law does and what decisions say, and the other is how to apply those decisions. And we have seen in the last few years the international institutions of justice, the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, really rise to the challenge You know, my Columbia Law School professor, the legendary Lou Henkin, famously said that almost all countries observe almost all principles of international law and almost all their obligations almost all of the time. That's true. But what happens when powerful states don't observe those? And, you know, we look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the crimes that were committed thereafter. We look at what Israel is doing in Gaza, the collective punishment, the disproportionate attacks, the indiscriminate attacks. And, you know, we say, you know, what happens then? But what we have seen is, over the last couple of years, first, you talked about the ICC requesting arrest warrants for Israeli and Hamas officials, also for Vladimir Putin. We see the International Court of Justice, the other court in The Hague, the court that deals with disputes between states, give these historic decisions. A decision in the case brought by South Africa for accusing Israel of genocide, in which the court, beginning in January, gave a succession of more and more detailed decisions calling on Israel, just not to attack Rafah, to halt what it is doing that could violate the Genocide Convention. We saw another decision from the International Court of Justice, probably one of the most sweeping decisions in history, saying that Israel's occupation of the territories had become illegal, that the settlements were illegal, calling on Israel to end its occupation as soon as possible, to dismantle the settlements. Now, what happens when the states don't abide by these decisions? And that's where, my colleague from Gaza, Raji Sourani, one of the great international lawyers, has said that Gaza it could be the graveyard for international law.
If I may, it brings to question why Israel's pressure campaign has been so successful in preventing anything from being done, despite all of the kind of unprecedented developments that you just mentioned there.
The United States. And what, the ICJ decision on settlements and occupation said third states have an obligation not to do anything that facilitates Israel's occupation and the settlements. In another decision, the ICJ said that reminded states that they have an obligation to make sure that their arms transfers do not make them complicit in violations of the Geneva Conventions and the Genocide Conventions. The problem here is that countries, and in particular, unfortunately, the United States, has become complicit through its support of what Israel is doing. Under criminal law, if somebody goes out on a shooting spree, committing crimes, and then runs into your store to get more ammunition, and you give that, here's the ammunition, go out, you are complicit in a crime. The bombs that are falling on Gaza are American bombs. The bombs that are hitting hospitals are American bombs. The United States is making itself legally complicit in the Israeli crimes. And it's because of the United States that Israel is getting away with these things.
Now, aside from what countries do, I think there's also a question about the role of international lawyers and prosecutors like yourself. There's been a legal debate about how to qualify what we've seen happen in Israel, in Gaza, now perhaps in Lebanon. What is the process for officially determining whether or not these different crimes, things like genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, are being committed? How is that determined, and by whom? I understand that there's a lot of political pressure, like that of the United States, like that of Israel that you mentioned, but it seems that pressure is also being exerted on the legal experts.
Sure. Well, the question for genocide is which is, of course, the most difficult. First of all, there are many crimes involved here. There are war crimes. It's quite obvious. The basic rule of conduct of war is to distinguish between civilians and military. You cannot attack civilian targets. You cannot attack civilians, and you cannot attack civilian targets. And even when you attack military targets, it can only be done in a way that is proportionate, in which the loss of civilian life and civilian object are not disproportionate to the military advantage. It's quite clear that Israel is committing war crimes. Crimes against humanity are basically war crimes committed on a massive or systematic scale. Genocide is harder to prove. Genocide happens when you have targeted a religious, national, ethnic group in order to eliminate them in whole or in part as such. And that's a crime of intention, and it's harder to prove. And that's what is at issue in South Africa's case at the International Court of Justice. And it's a very high bar. The decisions that the ICJ has rendered so far are like preliminary injunctions. They're decisions not on the merits. There is going to be, but it's going to take 2 or 3 or 4 years before the ICJ determines if what Israel is doing violates the Genocide Convention. So that is the body that will determine this. The ICC has issued indictments not for genocide, but for war crimes and for crimes against humanity. The prosecutor has charged Israel with the crime against humanity of starvation. Now, the reason that we believe the prosecutor chose the crime of starvation is because it is a crime that relates to the state policy of Israel. When you bomb a hospital where there are civilians, where there are military, the chances are that it would be a war crime, but you need to show whether there were military people there. You need to know what the targeters thought when they launched the attack. It's a very fact-specific determination. The policy of cutting off aid, of starving people, can be traced back to statements made and policies directed at the highest level of the Israeli government. And so that's easier to prove. So that there's no one place where all of these matters are going to be decided.
Professor, excuse me.
I'm sounding like a professor.
Very much so, which is a good thing. Plenty of information there. I have plenty of more questions for you, Reed Brody, but unfortunately they'll have to wait until the next time we speak. In the meantime, thank you very much for coming on the show.
You're quite welcome.